History remembers her as a saint, a martyr crowned in heaven, a painted face on chapel walls, haloed, serene, untouched by agony. But before she was an icon, she was a girl who lived, who bled, who argued, a girl whose bones were shattered on a wheel built not for punishment, but for spectacle. Her name was Catherine, later Latinized as Catherine of Alexandria. Her legend says she was born into royalty, educated beyond all women of her time, and killed by an empire that could not silence her tongue. But legends are merciful. They spare us the sound of screaming joints, of broken cartilage twisting under tension, of breath taken not by holiness, but by blood pooling in the lungs. If you wish to find the truth, you must not look at the stained glass. You must listen for the cracking of bones. The empire was tired. Rome, in its 4th century of dominion, still held the world by the throat, but its grip was weakening. The borders trembled. The gods of old, worn thin by too many sacrifices, no longer stirred the hearts of citizens. In place of zeal, there was weariness. The temples stood, but the prayers felt hollow. And into that fatigue, a new voice rose. Quietly at first, in secret homes, under curfewed stars, in whispers, Christians. They were not soldiers, not philosophers, not citizens of pride. They were dissent incarnate. They refused to bow to the emperor, refused to sacrifice to the gods, refused to speak when told to praise the state. And worst of all, they grew. By the time of Emperor Maxentius, the problem had become personal. He did not rule with reason. He ruled with fear. His Rome was a Rome of altars and blood, of harsh edicts and secret police. And his eyes had turned to Alexandria, a city of fire and learning. Alexandria had always defied the empire's expectations. It housed philosophers, magicians, Jews, mathematicians, Christians, all boiling together in a cultural cauldron. But the empire did not like cauldrons. It preferred order. And into this city of defiance, Catherine was born. She was a daughter of privilege. Her father, a noble, some say a king, though history offers no proof, but he was powerful enough to afford her the unthinkable: education. She studied not just scripture, but Aristotle, Plato, the mathematics of Ptolemy, the medicine of Galen. She was fluent in languages, skilled in dialectic, schooled in logic. By 17, she had already humiliated 3 tutors. They said she was too clever, that she read too quickly, that she understood too much. One called her dangerous, another a heretic in waiting. She smiled at them all. She had no husband. She rejected each suitor with a precision that bordered on cruelty. "I will only marry," she said, "a man who surpasses me in wisdom, beauty, and virtue." They laughed, but they did not laugh long, because the girl who could not be matched soon met a name that could not be denied: Christos, the Anointed One. The conversion, they say, came through a dream, a vision of a man robed in stars who spoke her name as though it had existed before her lips. She awoke, changed, not trembling, not weeping, but calm. It was not love, it was recognition. She was baptized in secret, but she did not stay silent. In the city, new edicts arrived, from Maxentius, from Rome. Temples to the old gods were to be restored, sacrifices mandated. All citizens were to offer incense to Mars and Jupiter in public. Catherine refused, not quietly. She marched into the emperor's court, 18 years old, robed not in modesty but in intellect, and challenged the decree. Alone, they say Maxentius was stunned that no woman had dared speak to him in public, let alone contradict his word. But she did not stammer. She did not kneel. She debated. And worse, she won. the emperor summoned his philosophers, 50 men trained in logic, scripture, dialectics, and rhetoric. They were told to humiliate her, to dismantle her beliefs in front of the court. Instead, one by one, they fell silent. Some converted, others refused to speak further. At least one was executed for his failure. And Catherine, still barely more than a girl, stood unmoved. She had not come to ask for mercy. She had come to reveal truth. Maxentius grew afraid, not of her hands, but of her voice. She spoke with the fire of someone who had nothing left to unlearn. She was not wild, not fanatical. She was precise, terrifyingly so. Her words cut cleaner than swords. And worse, others began to listen. Among them, the empress. The court trembled. This girl, this Christian, had begun to sway the heart of the empire itself. She was arrested, not beaten, not tortured, yet just taken, quietly, locked in a tower, left to rot in the silence where, they thought, her brilliance would dissolve. But brilliance in darkness becomes luminous. She prayed, she sang, she converted her guards. Maxentius was done with containment. He wanted spectacle. Rome had taught him that terror works best when it is public. And so, he chose a method that was not just execution, but orchestration. The breaking wheel, an instrument of agony, so exquisite it blurred the line between punishment and theater. It consisted of a large wooden circle studded with iron blades. The victim would be tied spread-eagle across its surface, arms and legs exposed. The executioner would then take a hammer or iron rod and strike between the bones, first at the ankles, then knees, wrists, elbows. Each blow calculated not to kill, but to destroy. After the limbs were broken, the wheel would be hoisted vertically and spun. The shattered body left hanging, twisted like cloth wrung dry. The crowd would weep, or cheer, or pray. The church called it martyrdom. Rome called it justice. But in truth, it was something older than either: ritualized dehumanization. And this was what awaited her. They brought Catherine to the square. The wheel stood gleaming in the sun. The blades had been freshly sharpened. The priests stood ready with incense. The executioners, 2 of them, waited for the signal. Maxentius did not attend, but his voice was there. In the crowd, in the silence that swelled like a storm, her name had become a warning. A word spoken too loudly could draw the attention of death. She did not cry. She did not look away. She looked at the wheel. And then, they say, something happened. The wheel shattered, not metaphorically, not in allegory. The iron snapped. The spokes split. The blades flew from the axle as if thrown by invisible hands. Some say lightning struck it, others that the wood buckled without reason. A piece of shrapnel killed a soldier standing too near. The executioners fled, and the crowd fell silent. For the first time, perhaps, Rome began to wonder if they were not burning heretics, but provoking something older, something divine. Maxentius, humiliated and furious, ordered her immediate beheading. No trial, no ritual, no more chances for speech. Her death was to be quiet, swift, unremarkable. But you cannot kill ideas with blades. When they brought her to the scaffold, her face was serene. She knelt, not in submission, but in purpose. And when the sword fell, they say, milk flowed from her neck instead of blood. A symbol, a warning, a miracle, or perhaps a metaphor too beautiful to question. Her body was said to be carried by angels to Mount Sinai, her voice carried farther, through centuries, through cathedrals, through the minds of women who refused to be silent. She was canonized, praised, venerated, but that was not her goal. She had not come to be worshipped, she had come to speak. And when the empire tried to silence her, it shattered. The wheel had shattered, but the empire still stood, or so it claimed. In the years that followed Catherine's death, Rome did not collapse in flame. The altars remained, the armies marched. The statues of the gods cast their long shadows across stone squares. But something had changed, something beneath the surface, where empires rot first. Her death, and the impossible ruin of her execution device, became a whisper the empire could not silence. A rumor dressed in myth, a crack in the stone. Catherine had not fought with weapons. She had not led armies. She had not incited rebellion. And that was what terrified them most, because she had not been broken before she was killed. Her mind had remained intact. Her voice had not wavered. Even on the scaffold, she had not begged. And that kind of endurance cannot be dismissed. It leaves a shape in the collective memory, like a wound that never scabs over. There was something obscene about the breaking wheel. More than a device of execution, it was a theater of agony, engineered not just to kill, but to transform the condemned into a public example. The goal was not death, it was obliteration. Every bone, every joint, every inch of structure in the human frame was to be twisted, bent, smashed, until the body no longer resembled a body. Until it became an object, a message, a mangled warning. And yet the wheel had broken. This was not supposed to happen. The ritual had failed. Rome knew ritual. It depended on it. From sacrifices to law, from senate to sword. Everything in the empire flowed from the belief that structure was sacred, that order was unshakable. And in that moment, as Catherine stood before the crowd and the wheel exploded in violence that did not belong to Roman hands, something more than metal broke. The belief in control cracked. Some said it was sabotage, that Christian sympathizers had weakened the frame, that a carpenter had filed the joints too thin, that some priest in secret had blessed it against itself. Others believed what they saw with their own eyes, divine intervention. Whatever the cause, the effect was irreversible. Catherine's name became unkillable. She was not just martyred, she was mythologized. Not by the church, not yet. That would come later. She was first made sacred by the people, by the women who remembered her defiance, by the men who saw her arguments outlast philosophers, by slaves, by peasants, by dreamers. They carried her name in whispered prayers, in songs, in stories told at the edge of hearthlight, long after the soldiers had gone. And then the church, late, cautious, political, took notice, the sans quality. Christianity, still illegal but spreading, had begun to understand the power of narrative. The Gospels told of one resurrection, but martyrdom could be multiplied. Every death that defied Rome became a new gospel. Every saint a living scripture. And Catherine, brilliant, unmarried, unyielding, was perfect. They cleaned the story. They crowned her in visions. They painted her robes white. They put words in her mouth she never spoke, softened her defiance into piety, turned her refusal to marry into virginal holiness. The intellect became purity. The fire of argument became the glow of sanctity. She was made palatable, consumable, marketable. But beneath the gold leaf and incense, the bones remained, shattered, still echoing, still defying. Catherine's body was said to have been carried by angels to Mount Sinai, to rest where Moses had once seen God in a burning bush. A fitting symmetry, one prophet from the old law, one martyr from the new, two flames, two voices that spoke truth in the face of power, and were nearly consumed for it. Pilgrims traveled to that mountain for centuries. They wept beside her shrine. They drank water from a spring said to have burst from the ground at her feet. They prayed not just for miracles, but for strength. Because what Catherine offered was not rescue, it was resistance, and the wheel became a symbol, not of torture, of the failed attempt to silence her. In medieval Europe, when women began to rise in spiritual life, Beguines, mystics, visionaries, it was Catherine they looked to. Not Mary. Mary was obedience. Catherine was defiance. Mary accepted her fate. Catherine challenged it. Mary gave birth to the Word. Catherine became it. Churches began to place wheels in stained glass windows, but they were never broken. Always whole, always spinning, as if to say the machine had become a halo, the torture device, a crown. It was not just a reclamation, it was a reversal. Rome had made her into a symbol of failure. The Church turned her into a saint of power. But even that could not fully contain her. There are records, fragmented, doubted, dismissed, of Catherine appearing in visions centuries after her death, to prisoners, to queens, to monks on the edge of apostasy. In each vision she does not smile. She does not speak in riddles. She appears only to ask one question. What have you done with your voice? And that perhaps is the legacy she never relinquished. Because Catherine did not die for her God. She died for the right to speak of him. She died because Rome believed its laws were louder than truth, and they were not. The wheel did not kill her. The sword did. But even that blade was late. By the time it fell, she had already become more than a body. She had become the thing the empire feared most, an idea. And ideas do not bleed. They echo. By the late Middle Ages, Catherine of Alexandria had become something far more than a name. She was not simply remembered. She was reenacted, repainted, retold. Her story echoed from stone cloisters to whispered convent corridors, from painted altarpieces in silent cathedrals to blood-stained battlefields where men invoked her name before dying with her image pressed to their hearts. She was everywhere, but she was no longer herself. The Catherine who lived and died under Maxentius, the philosopher-martyr with a blade for a mind, was slowly drowned beneath layers of legend. The Church, now triumphant in its power, could not abide a female saint too clever, too argumentative, too free. And so they softened her, they blunted her angles. The woman who once debated with fire became the maiden in white. Her voice, once razor-sharp and unsparing, was recast as docile wisdom. In stained glass, she is beautiful, but no longer terrifying. That, of course, was the point. The medieval world needed saints who could be used. Catherine became a symbol of noble virginity, of womanhood made holy through restraint. Her wheel, once an emblem of broken machinery, of failed execution, of imperial impotence, was rebranded into an abstract icon. A prop. A silhouette on banners, in coats of arms, on shields. Knights bore her image into war, asking for clarity of thought and clean conscience before bloodshed. Universities adopted her as patroness of scholars and philosophers. Young girls were told her story as a cautionary tale, cloaked in glory. This is what happens when purity meets power, when womanhood stays uncorrupted, when brilliance is made submissive to divine order. But none of that was what she died for. She did not die to become a symbol of obedience. She died because she refused it. And her silence was not docile, it was deliberate. Her defiance was not arrogant, it was necessary. She had been intelligent, eloquent, radical. And in a world still terrified of women who were all three, her story had to be rewritten in gold. But the truth has a way of hiding in the cracks of its own legends. In the private journals of mystics, her name returned differently. In the late 13th century, a Beguine named Mechtilde of Magdeburg ascribed a vision of a woman holding a shattered wheel in one hand and a broken sword in the other. She said the woman's eyes glowed like iron pulled from fire, and that her voice was so quiet it burned. This was not the Catherine of courtly stories. This was the Catherine of collapse, a woman who spoke until the very machinery of death failed beneath her, a woman who looked empire in the eye and did not blink. In some versions of her legend, Catherine's soul does not rise gently into heaven. It flies, like fire, carried by angels, not upward, but outward, across lands, across languages, into books and sermons and arguments. She becomes a patron not of virtue, but of speech, of language wielded like steel, of faith that refuses simplification, of conviction that outlives the flesh. And the wheel, oh, the wheel, it does not stop spinning, but not because it works, because it broke. By the Renaissance, she was one of the 14 holy helpers, her name invoked in plague, in childbirth, in the face of unjust death. But even then, the artists couldn't help but slip in pieces of the older truth. In Caravaggio's rendering, she stands defiant, hands bound but posture upright, the wheel cracked behind her. In a Flemish triptych, her eyes stare straight through the canvas, not to heaven, but to the viewer, as though asking if they too will speak when the empire demands silence. And still, even now, she returns, in paintings, in dreams, in protests. In the voice of a girl who refuses to accept that power is always right, she is remembered not just for her death, but for the quiet ferocity that made her dangerous to a world built on obedience. Her bones may have been crushed, but her mind remained unbroken, and the wheel, designed to destroy her, did not. Her story is not about pain. It is about the moment pain fails to control. It is not about martyrdom. It is about memory that resists translation. It is not about sainthood. It is about a soul who chose not to bow. And when the world tells you that Catherine was just a virgin martyr, a gentle woman who died quietly and sweetly for her God, remember, they gagged her before she could speak her last words, because they feared them more than her blood, because words are bones too, and some of them do not break. They made her into a saint, then a statue, then a story. And now she lingers between all three, too sacred to question, too historical to feel, too symbolic to hear. But every few generations, the silence splits. A moment comes, a voice rises, a girl refuses. And suddenly, Saint Catherine is not an icon on a wall, but a presence, a force, a question. What is your voice worth? In the modern age, her wheel rolls again, not across blood-soaked execution grounds, but across courtrooms, universities, border fences, voting booths. Its blades are bureaucracy, censorship, the quiet, precise pressure of systems designed to mangle without drawing blood. But the purpose remains the same: to make the dangerous into examples, to reduce the articulate into ash, to remind the body that power speaks louder than truth. And still her story returns. Not just in cathedrals, but in classrooms. Not just in hagiographies, but in protests. Not just in faith, but in refusal. There are girls who speak now where they shouldn't. They raise their hands in rooms not built for them. They question the curriculum. They push back on decrees. They walk into boardrooms and parliaments and pulpits and prisons, and they ask the same questions Catherine once asked in Maxentius's court. Why should I bow to what is wrong? Why should I offer incense to a lie? Some of them are told they are too young, too proud, too loud, too clever, too dangerous, just as she was. Some of them are punished, not with wheels but with silence, not with blood but with ridicule, not with steel but with exile. And yet they speak. And in that speech, Catherine breathes. It is strange how memory works, how bones can be broken, burned, scattered and still form a skeleton of resistance. How silence, when chosen, can thunder louder than rage. How the wheel meant to crush became the most enduring symbol of revolt. Catherine of Alexandria is not just a saint for virgins and scholars. She is a saint for the unbroken, the articulate, the disobedient, the ones who are told to kneel and instead ask, to what and why? She was not born for her legend. She did not write it. She was not crowned in her life. She was executed in it. But history does not always obey the empire. Sometimes it listens to bones. The church eventually canonized her, gave her a feast day, put her name in litanies. But in many ways it was too late. Catherine had already left their hands. She belonged to the girl alone in a library, discovering fire in a forbidden book. She belonged to the protester who refuses to shut up. She belonged to the woman who keeps her name off the paper but not out of the room. She belonged to anyone who has stood against the machinery of cruelty and said without blinking, "Break me if you must. I will not worship what is false." The wheel is still here. It has changed shapes, but it turns. It waits, and Catherine still stands before it. Not afraid, not weeping, not weak, but ready. And if you listen, truly listen, not to the legends but to the marrow, you will hear what the empire heard in its final failure. A voice, clear, sharp, whole, and utterly unwilling to die.